Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Welcome to the second of the Tuesday afternoon enology breakout sessions. I'm Carl Weichold, the assistant winemaker at Erath. Promise I'll try to keep this on track. I know I'm the last thing between you and your reservation at Kachka. We'll be talking about considerations for picking and lab analysis during harvest. First of all, I'd like to thank Bree Stock as well as the OWB Education Committee for all the hard work that they put into such interesting panels this year's symposium. Let's give them a round of applause right quick. All right, so talking picking decisions. Picking decisions end up being what many of us regard as the key choice that guides wine quality and style. With our modern suite of analytical methods, we've never had as much data on which to base this decision. But are we basing it on data that matter? Have we collected that data accurately and meaningfully? Are certain metrics more meaningful in the context of other metrics? Have we made the most informed choices for the purposes of style and intent in winemaking when it comes to calling picks? For our panel today, we'll discuss how best to approach the processes of sampling and data collection in the vineyard, then move to perspectives on useful and analytical methods for logistical considerations for both rosé and white programs as well as red programs, and finally look to the future of understanding the physiology of ripening with a more sophisticated and intentional approach to driving wine style through harvest decisions. For our speakers today, we have head viticulturalist Jeff Hall from Argyle Winery here to discuss best practices for meaningful grape sampling. After a master's at WSU Prosser, Jeff held positions at St. Michel Wine Estates and numerous other international posts before coming on at Argyle to head up their VIT program, as well as programs in Napa and Sonoma. Next, to discuss perspectives on how harvest data informs decisions to achieve house style for white and rosé production. We'll hear from Anna Prost. Anna is a Cal Poly graduate that has worked at numerous positions in California, New Zealand, and Australia before joining A to Z as their associate winemaker. For perspectives on house style and harvest decisions on red programs, we'll hear from Olivier Prost. Olivier began with stops in Languedoc-Roussillon, Bordeaux, and Burgundy before heading to Australia, New Zealand, and Napa, and finally with A to Z as their associate winemaker. And finally, to discuss more modern approaches to understanding the physiology of grape ripening, we'll have Cecilia Cunningham with Vivalis. Cecilia holds degrees in engineering and agriculture and began her wine career researching vine stress at INRA in Gruson. She has worked internationally for houses like Chandon, Hess, and Indivin, and now consults for Vivalis, a global wine R&D organization. So with that, I'm going to pass this over to Jeff.
All right, thanks for having me. So today, one of the things I want to do when we're talking about harvest sampling from a vineyard perspective is it's just a simple question like, why are we doing this? It seems pretty obvious. The obvious answer is quality. We always want to pick the best grapes at the best time. But as a vineyard manager, there's a lot of things kind of going on in the back of my head that influence everything we do for our grape sampling and harvest decisions. Logistics, which is not a sexy word at all during harvest, but it plays a really big impact on what we're doing throughout harvest. So from a vineyard perspective, that could be all the way from, how many rows are we going to walk, how much time do we have, how many people do I have available to take those samples, and then all the way to, where's my contractor, how many people does he have, what vineyard do we have all of our tractors at. Those things influence when I'm going to go out and sample a vineyard, because I don't want to go out and sample a vineyard that we're not going to be able to get to for a week. And then from a winery perspective, there's always the how many tons can be processed in a day. That's for actually picked grapes, but even processed grapes, which I think Anna and Olivier will get into as well. It's, I'm not going to go out and take 50 samples, spend up my entire day doing it, bring it in the winery, and they're like, we don't have the people to actually do anything with this. So those logistics are always kind of on the back of our minds in terms of when we're going to be actually taking samples. And those influence the resources we have. We always want to maximize the resources. So for me, a lot of the times this is, if you've got vineyards kind of all over the valley, maybe you're picking up stuff from Umpqua Valley or the Rogue, you want to make sure that if you're going to go get something that's 2.5 hours away as a sample, that you're not just getting something that's 19 bricks, but you're going to pick it in 4 weeks at 24. You want to make sure that you're sending that person, or if it's you or the winemaker, to that vineyard at the right time. And I think one of the things that's often overlooked during harvest for sampling is that, to me, it's one of the best times to do your last scouting. So I often describe my position as, especially during harvest, is making sure there's no surprises for the winemaker. So I don't want grapes to show up that have rot on them. I don't want them to be dehydrated. I don't want them to have, differences in yield. But if that is going to be the case, I want to make sure that the winemaker knows about it before I get the phone call and he's like, hey, did you know that, there was 25% botrytis in this block? And I'm like, really? I didn't see that coming at all. Because the winemaker is going to be able to make better decisions and be able to adapt to some of those challenges if they know about it beforehand. And there's no better time than just walking up and down your rows and grabbing clusters. So this is a quote that I think at every symposium I've ever been to, I hear a winemaker say, it's, when to pick is the most important decision I make in a vintage. And I do believe that that's actually true. And if it is true, one of the things that I want to get across to all the winemakers in the room is make sure that the people that you're working with, sort of your key consults, know what the intent of each block is. And I'll kind of walk through some of those situations, because from my perspective, as a vineyard manager, whether I'm, estate fruit or selling that fruit, the winemaker is my customer. And as the saying goes, the customer is always right. With winemakers, that's mostly true, not 100% of the time. And I mean that in that the winemakers, your time is really precious during harvest. You're trying to split your time between the winery, if you're going out to the vineyard. And if you can have your vineyard managers or your lab interns or whoever's doing your sampling for you, if they know what you're looking for, I think you're going to get better information, better data, and you're going to make a better decision about picking. And some examples of that are just knowing the intended destination of every block. So is it sparkling or is it still? Those are two really different sampling protocols, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Is it high tier versus production? And that might go down to how many rows are you going to walk in a 1 acre high tier block versus a 10 acre production block. What kind of variability do you have? And to me, the most important thing is, again, this is allocating the resources, but getting the winemaker to the field at the right time. Your time is precious, and I don't want to bring you out to a block where I'm like, yeah, I think it's pretty close. I think you should come out and make a decision. You come out and you taste, and you're like, what the hell? This is green. It's, it's 21 bricks. I want to make sure that if you're going to come out and look at it, that it's close to being able to make a decision. If not, maybe you have to come out one more time. And getting a winemaker to the right location. This may seem pretty obvious. You might just, go up to a block and stop and get out. But as vineyard managers or anyone that you have out in the vineyard most of the time, they're walking up and down those rows a lot, all throughout the year. So we kind of know those areas where those zones are. And there's kind of a joke in the wine industry about, winemaker rows. So, you have the winemaker out, you pull up to this one section, it looks beautiful, and, the rest of the block doesn't. And we don't do that necessarily, but we do want to take you to the right portion of the block. Because, again, your time's limited. I'm not going to stop, every 20 rows to be like, well, this one's different than the other side. If you're going to come out to that block, I want to make sure that where you are is going to help you make a decision on the entire block. I'm not going to take you to the, the southeast corner that's really vigorous and really green if it's only 2% of the actual fruit that's going to come off of there. I want to kind of hit you somewhere in the middle on the average. And this is just a map that we put together right before harvest that showcases, where our experiments are, where sparkling versus still is, where's going to be machine picked, where's high tier, and anything is labeled with number of tons, number of rows that it is, so that even if I'm not out there, the winemaker just knows where to go to get there. Just makes it easier for everyone, better communication. So down to the methods of actually harvest sampling. And the first thing I want to say is if you're doing something that is helping you make informed decisions about harvest and you feel comfortable with those, keep doing that. Everybody has a different method. Everybody has something that they're comfortable with. And, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you what is right. I don't think Anna and Olivier are as well. I'm just going to share kind of my experience with what I've done in the past and where I've kind of landed over the years. So berry versus cluster, I've done both extensively, and I've kind of settled in at Argyle to berry sampling. There's a few reasons for this. One is that at the winery it's really difficult to process the cluster samples. And two, when I'm going out and sampling berries, I'm kind of just walking down the row and I'm basically grabbing a whole cluster and just kind of ripping off a few berries. And I'm able to fit, 50 clusters worth of berry samples, 10 to 20 berries each from each cluster, into, a small little Ziploc bag that I can stuff in my pocket or I can throw in the back of the truck pretty quickly. If I was to go out and get the same number of clusters that I would actually sample, 50 or so, and take whole cluster samples off of that, we're talking about 2 to 3 grocery bags that I've got to pile in the back of the truck, and then also the winery has to process. So for me, it's just ease, and I'm also able to get across more clusters that way. Random versus intentional, and this is, we're talking about which row do you walk down, so again, those winemaker rows, but also when you're walking down a row. So I want to make sure that the rows we're walking down are somewhat average. I don't have time to walk up 15 rows in a block. So I'm going to go down the rows that I think fit that block and that are the most average, most representative of it. And also when I'm going down a row, you could be extremely random and just look away and grab a cluster. But, if you're only sampling 25 clusters worth, 1 to 2 clusters that just don't fit the rest of the block, to just look a little bit different, maybe there's damage. That's assuming that 4 to 8% of the block looks like that, when really it might not be. So it's not a bad idea just to take a look at that cluster, especially if there's any botrytis or something and you're going to throw that botrytis cluster out. Don't go out sampling botrytis clusters just to be random. Walking versus an ATV, this is pretty simple for me. If you have the time, walk, for all the reasons I talked about earlier, scouting. But I get it. If you have 400-acre vineyard and there's 50 blocks and you've got to get through all of them, you're probably not going to walk all of it in one day. Baseline versus a harvest decision. So these are two really different sampling methods for me. A baseline is, it's way too early to be making a decision on that. You're just going out to get a number. It's going to inform where you're going to allocate your resources for the next couple weeks in terms of sampling. So, everything's at 20 bricks, but you just want to find that one where it stands out and you're like, whoa, that one's 22. Let's keep an eye on that. I'm not going to walk up 10 rows just to get those numbers. We're going to pop out of our truck, grab a few random ones. If something pops out, we'll go sample it for sure later. That's different than the harvest decision where we will walk a few rows to try to get that nice number. And again, scouting, it's observing your fruit in your canopy. These two pictures are of different vineyards at the same time. And let's just assume that they're both at 24 bricks. If I took these samples back to the winery and the winemaker hadn't been out to look at these, he doesn't know that the one on the bottom right has a bunch of yellow leaves, whereas the one on the top left still looks nice and green and looks like it can still keep photosynthesizing. And that type of color commentary, I think, is really important for the winemaker to make those decisions, because they might just be looking at 24 bricks and go, all right, let's go for the one that's green. But it doesn't take into account those harvest logistics or the canopy as well. And this is one that tasting is one that I think is really important, because some of the most informative times I've ever had with winemakers is right before harvest, going out and tasting with them and asking them questions in terms of, what are you looking for? Is this the flavor? What does this taste like? And I'm not a winemaker, so I'll never be making those harvest decisions, but being informed about what my winemaker wants or is looking for is going to inform the information that I'm going to provide them in the future. And hopefully, catch those surprises and be like, I know that, you said we're kind of looking for this number, but you should come out and taste this, because I think it's what you were looking for before. I think that's really important. So if winemakers could spend that time, I think it helps a lot. The timing of when to sample. So at Argyle, we do a lot of sparkling wine as well as still wine. And our sampling protocol for the two are very different. And that's mostly because how fast things are ripening for sparkling is really different than when it's for still. So your blue and your orange lines there, blue is Chardonnay that we picked for sparkling, orange is Pinot Noir for sparkling, and then the gray one at the top is still. So, that blue line, which is Chardonnay, we went out and we sampled it as 16 and a half bricks. We're like, looks pretty good. Still got some time. We're looking for 18 to 20 or so. Sampled it again in a couple days, expecting to jump. It was at 17 something. Labor Day happened. We didn't get back around to sampling until that Tuesday. All of a sudden it was 19. By the time we picked it, it was 20 plus. That thing was moving at about 0.4 bricks a day. So we needed to be on top of that, probably even better than we were, because we might have picked it a little bit later. And the same for the Pinot Noir. We went out and went, let's just see what that Pinot Noir is. It's probably a little bit too early, right? Before Labor Day, it's 19. After Labor Day, it's 21. I was moving half a bricks a day. You compare that against the still Pinot Noir at the top. The first time we sampled it, it's 22. Maybe goes to 22.4 in a couple days. We had a rain event. Eventually, it ends up at 24 bricks by the time we pick it, but that's ripening at 0.4 bricks a day. So that curve is really different, whether or not you're looking for still versus sparkling. And that sampling period for sparkling is really chaotic because we're just trying to get as many samples as we can in because we don't want to miss something because it takes a couple days to get something picked after we sampled it. We talked a little bit about location. I don't have a formula for how many rows, how many vines, how many clusters you should sample. This should be what makes you feel comfortable. I will say just don't overdo it. We've done the 25 clusters, we've done 50, we've done 100, we've done 10. And you really hit a point somewhere where statistically speaking, you're not getting a difference by doing 50 to 100 clusters. Somewhere around that 25 to 30, we feel pretty comfortable we're going to get a good number as long as you're taking that representative sample. And again, random versus purposeful. This is an NDVI image of a 5-acre block. It's one of our high-end blocks. And if I was going out here and just being random, I'd just walk up and down maybe 5, 10 rows in there, depending on how much time I have. And it would be a composite of the entire thing. But as you can see, the west versus the east side, which I think, there it is. The NDVI is really different, and we didn't need an NDVI to tell us this. We knew this all the way through the season, that these two zones are completely different. They don't look the same. They don't taste the same. So we went out and we sampled them different. And what we found was the west side was about 22.1 bricks. The east side was about 24. It was the same block, and if we had gone through and just sampled them all together, we would have ended up with the 23. We probably would have made a picking decision based off of that. But I don't think we would have gotten the variability that we're actually looking for out of that block. This one's going into, again, our higher end wines. We want to nail it. We want to hit it right on the money. And just coming in and blending those two things together, I don't think we would have made a better wine than if we had split them apart. So we ended up finding that row where we picked them separately. And they're two fantastic wines, but they're two very different styles of wine. And I think this just goes back to, this is an intentional sampling. It's also an intentional harvest where we are picking kind of the zones out of each block. And I wouldn't have known that had I not been in communication with the winemaker about how important the block is, that there had been variability in the past, that, fermenters had been kind of, one fermenter would be really good, the next fermenter would be not so good, they'd be very different. We couldn't figure out why. You split them in half and we have those differences. Again, I'm kind of beating a dead horse here with the word logistics, but they are really important, and this is just a timeline of what it takes to get something picked. So, Monday you go out and you sample it in the morning. It's hopefully processed by midday. You've got data by the afternoon. Most people probably want to get out and take a look at that. Most winemakers probably want to get out, see the block, taste it. Maybe you have a decision by that Tuesday afternoon after you've kind of juggled where you're actually picking from, how many tons the winery can process. you can pretty much guarantee you're not picking Wednesday if you're making a decision Tuesday afternoon, or hopefully you're not doing that to your vineyard management company. So that looks like, Thursday is probably your earliest pick. And if you guys have dealt with labor and you've called a vineyard management company and said, hey, we'd like to pick tomorrow, they go, that's pretty funny. And you're like, okay, what about the day after? And they're like, no, we're booked out for the next 4 days. Keep in mind that, if you're making sparkling, those things are moving at half a brix a day. And yeah, that ripening curve will kind of level off eventually, but that's when it's about 22 brix. So just kind of, again, those things that we're keeping in the back of our mind all the time about when we're sampling. I'm making a sampling decision knowing that we're not going to pick it for 4 days at the earliest. So it's just really important to kind of keep those logistics and have that communication with your winemaking team as well. And that's it for me.
Up next are Anna and Olivier to discuss harvest data and how it drives house style.
Thank you, Carl and Jeff. I think when Carl asked A to Z to participate, I don't know if he knew he was going to get a two for one deal with Olivier and I, so we're going to try to share some helpful tips of what we use to measure. I'm going to grab that. So we like to talk about this at A to Z with measure what matters, and that's, I think, depending on your style of wine that you want to make and the goal that you're aiming for with it, that will help you determine what you want to measure, and of course the intention that you have and kind of your philosophy behind the wine will help you look towards those parameters that you wanted to start measuring. And also the word challenges, or some people may see that word as opportunities, of knowing if you have some logistics, as Jeff was saying. I think that's part of the decision that you need to consider. And for us, we have committed to collecting data over time. And so I think that's a nice base that you can get with collecting or committing the time and over time to getting that whole base of data that you can start to look at different parameters. And so I speak of a common language. We talk about brix, pH, and TA. We all kind of throw those numbers around. But when you're looking into new parameters, the first data point is not always actionable. And so I think that collection over time, you can start talking about it and adding the brix, pH, TA, and maybe a phenolics number with it, and try to look at your data as a whole and see how you can integrate that into a language that you can then speak about and speak more intelligently about later on and help inform your decisions. So Olivier will go through a few examples of that, and we'll talk about the whites and rosés, and then also the red wines as well.
Thank you. Thank you. So for us, harvest, the countdown starts at bloom. So it's very important for us to be able to have a bloom date as accurate as possible. To do that, and because our vineyards are scattered throughout the whole state, they are pretty big, we track the heat accumulation within each of those regions. And once we get close to that 500 growing degree days, which is the marker for bloom to happen, we then intensify our vineyard scouting. So from those original bloom dates, we'll have a preliminary idea on the general harvest window, as well as the breakdown per region. So that's going to help us out having an initial map of how things will be coming in. As a side note, it will also help us to hire our seasonal help, aka our interns. So, double win here. Then, as far as what comes next, tying up a little bit of what Jeff talked about, timing of sampling, we'll go into a baseline sampling. So within a week, we'll be sampling across all the vineyards, across all the varieties, clones, and AVAs. And we traditionally do that at about 85 to 90 days post-bloom. So from there, we'll do, again, simple brix, pH, TA. We also typically will keep monitoring the growing degree days and also paying attention to the air quality index as well. So with those numbers, that will help us refine our initial thoughts, having a clearer vision of how harvest is going to play out. And that will also help us starting making some winemaking plans, buying specific additions, or so on, depending on how harvest is shaping up. As we get closer to the picking windows, we can switch to what we call a maturity check. Again, basic Brix pH/TA, but we'll add to that malic and tartaric acid, the YAN composition, glucose, fructose, potassium, and we'll also be looking at some phenolic compounds for white, red, and rosé as well. So again, meanwhile, we'll keep throughout monitoring the growing degree days and air quality. That's very important to us. So from that, all the info that we've gathered will come up with a visual representation of what came in when, based on vineyards and AVAs. So it's something that we can visually, it's visual, we can quickly reference, and that's going to give us a context of past vintages. Again, we all have the ideas that the warm regions tend to come in earlier, and the cooler ones tend to come in last, but it's not always that simple in our world. So a couple of other factors, obviously, we'll be looking at some point. The fruit condition, is there any disease, dehydration, sunburn, splitting? We also, at A2Z, we make blended wines. We don't make single vineyards. So we need to pay attention to the blend production. As far as Pinot Noir goes, we only make one wine, really. So we need to pay extra attention. So do we need to correct a peak that maybe we have undershot or overshot on the first pass? And a couple of what we call X factors, smoke events or even frost, like we've seen last year.
So I think with the historical data that kind of helps shape our timing of the projections, as Olivier was saying, and we have the geographical diversity of the vineyards, how do we actually get there? So our process for the maturity samples, of course, the ideal is to be sampling a vineyard 2 to 3 times before picking. That's ideal. Doesn't always happen. But when we get the samples to the winery, how do we process them? So we usually get them in cluster samples, so 25 to 50 cluster samples. And then one way for us this past year to be able to process all those samples, we wanted to bring uniformity to that. We purchased a mini crusher that allowed us to crush those clusters instead of depending on different people kind of smashing them by hand. We sped up the process to get to the juice stage faster. So that was great for us to be able to send them through a mini crusher. And then as you can see on the right, the juice samples that we have bottles that are set aside for tasting. We think it's really important. You can taste actually the flavors and samples and see if there still is that green apple malic acid in there, or if you're tasting maybe something that's moldy. And those are kind of tips that you can get if you can't get out to all the vineyards, but having that juice sample to taste. And then we centrifuge each of the samples, and we run Brix, pH, and TA. We have just a handheld density meter that we do, a pH meter, and then an auto titrator for TA. And then for our extended juice panels, we will use an automatic wine analyzer. And then later on, I'll speak about phenolics that we do in-house with a spec. So that's kind of how we get through all of the samples from across the state. Of course, with a good sampling schedule, you can get there, but then to actually physically get to the juice stage where we can analyze the data and then have information to go back and say, okay, we are ready to pick, and have that information back to the vineyard team. So I think just an insight for our juice panels of what we look at. I talked about the Brix pH/TA being the common language, the standard chemistries that we look at, but we also dive a little deeper in our maturity samples of the malic tartaric acid ratio, hopefully 2 to 1. We look for those, and then of course paying attention to the ammonia, primary amino nitrogen, and the YAN contribution. That's going to give us a heads up on what this ferment might need and what the health of the vines are and the vineyard as well. And then we like to expand on glucose, fructose. As Olivier mentioned, we make blended wines, so we'd like to know the potential alcohol, and that's having that measurement, not just the Brix, but the glucose, fructose will give us a number for the fermentable sugars, and so we can better predict our potential alcohol across the whole blend. And then something we've done, we've checked in-house on and off over the years is potassium. That plays a role, as most of you know, in pH buffering. You can have, two musts can have very similar TAs but different pHs, and so we try to pay attention to that number, and then we could also always go back to that, to the vineyard and say what's giving us that high potassium, or being able to look at those wines and ferment them differently based on those numbers. And downstream on the wine stage, it has an implication for cold stability. So we like to have that whole panel as a base of knowledge that we can build on from there and start talking about those numbers wholly. So for the intention for the A to Z whites and rosés, the majority of the fruit is machine harvested. So we look at that, the transportation time and what that does for, let's say, Pinot Gris that likes to split open quite easily on its way up, and what does that do for the wine and the juices when they actually arrive here. And then also there's stainless steel fermentations. We don't go through malolactic fermentations, so those acid numbers are very important to us. That's why we are checking them separately, and then these are usually early to market wines. So to dive in for the white and rosé phenolics panels on those maturity samples that we're getting in, we're looking at a standard phenolics, so A280 and A420 can lend to give us information on the harshness and browning. Like Jeff was talking about different sides of the vineyard, you might have a higher A280 if those vines are more exposed, they have less canopy. Do you want to do a split pick? Should we press them differently? We're going to be looking at those numbers, so that'll inform our winemaking decisions later on. And as well, in a year that you might have some rot or botrytis, that A420 browning potential you might have in the juice can inform us what we might need to do to ameliorate that in the must. And then one thing that we've added on here is A520, usually checked for red wines. But for the white wines, especially Pinot Gris, we want to know the amount of red that might be along with those skins. So that's giving us another marker even at the juice stage that we can look at, especially for the rosés as well, of what we're going to get with just the fruit coming in the door. And then another thing that we've added on are the kind of the visible color. We have a portable colorimeter that we can just take a snapshot basically of the visible color of the juice that's coming in, so we can line up all those juice cups and say, okay, where do we land on this? And we can refer to last year when we picked at this Brix, what was the actual visible color along with all of the other phenolics numbers in there. So that kind of gives us a snapshot. It's a lot of data, and once you look at it over the years, you start to be able to learn the language and speak about it with other people, and then even speaking to our partners and growers about this is why we are looking at the numbers. This is the intention of how we want to make this wine. We want this number to be lower, or we want this number to be higher, so we can press it this way and kind of move the fermentation there. So I think that's what we've done with committed to the data collection kind of over the years. So just to pass it along to Olivier to see what we do on the red side, that's what kind of our intention is for the white wines. Thank you.
So when talking about intent and style for Pinot Noir, our goal is to make a wine that's mildly structured, dark color wine, and also a good mid-palate weight. So in order to do that, we really need to have some ripe phenolic harvest. We certainly prioritize that over sugar and acid level in our picking decisions. What is phenolic maturity and what does it look like? So it's in this graph, it's the ideal line represented in the textbook, in this textbook graph. When following the sugar and acid maturity, we try to catch the moment when we are at the peak of anthocyanins just before they start degrading. This is when typically the skin tannins will be at their highest and the seed tannins will be at their lowest. So in the perfect world of Cabernet Sauvignon and Syrah, that all makes sense and it's all good. In our reality of finicky Pinot Noir, it's a little bit more complicated. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So how do we measure grape phenolic maturity? There are several ways, of course. The one that we tend to all do when we go at vineyards is the berry sensor assessment, tasting for flavors, how much color can be extracted when rubbing the skins, color of the seeds from green to brown, so the softness of the berries, how the pulp adheres to the skin or the seeds, and also assessing the skin tannins for intensity astringency. There are also some in-house methods that you can do. There are some assays that are available out there. We settled on the Glori's method. It sounded cool to us, and also we can check anthocyanin concentration, extractability of those anthocyanins, the contribution of the seed tannins, and also the total phenolic. And of course, you can send samples to your favorite third-party lab, and they will do all those grape phenolic maturity for you. So curious to see what this model that we looked at on the graph before would look like for an Oregon Pinot Noir. Well, we set up a trial last harvest. We sampled 6 different vineyards across 4 different AVAs, and we sampled those vineyards 4 times and measured their phenolic contents. We can look at we have 2 results that I will show today. One vineyard is up in the Columbia River Gorge, and then the other one is in the Umpqua Valley. So on the vertical axis, you can see the concentration of the 3 polyphenolic marker, and also at the bottom, on the horizontal axis, are the time lapse expressed in days post-bloom. So we have 3 curves. In blue, we have the total anthocyanins. In red, we have the total tannins. And in yellow, the catechin. So right off the bat, it's pretty straightforward. You can see that those curves don't quite look like the textbook ones that we looked a minute ago. So, Pinot Noir is definitely not as predictable as other varieties, but that's why we love it pretty much. So we can see here the truncated maturation in the gorge and the extended hang time in the Umpqua. Despite the shorter hang times in the gorge, we can see that there is a lower catechin number. As far as when looking at the same time lapse, so 109 days, well, we can see the clear difference, and that definitely justify having a longer hang time in that specific block in the Umpqua Valley. So my takeaway here is that, I'm not pretending for a second that by analyzing grapes, we're going to be able to make picking decisions solely on that data. But for us, what we've learned from that trial is that measuring the grape phenolic maturity, it's a tool that's available for us to bring a little bit more objectivity in our picking decisions, and how can we be also more educated. Broadly speaking, it was also a good tool for us to get to know better our young vineyards, and also give another layer, again, of objectivity when we do team-based winemaking decisions. So it's also a great way, as Anna was saying, it's also a great way to have conversation with our growers partners, just besides the bricks and TA. So again, having a bit more vocabulary in our language, this is where we're looking after.
And I think we talked about, perfect vintages rarely happen, but I think being able to reference our past experiences, either if it's notes in a notebook or another data point on a graph, I think it helps inform us for decisions for the next vintages. So if anyone's ready for the next one, it's going to be here pretty soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
And finally, we've got Cecilia to talk about more modern and sophisticated approaches to modeling the physiology of grape ripening.
Okay. Thanks, Carl. I'm going to be presenting today another indicator that it may sound new for some of you. It may be used at this point because it's very simple. It's very easy to measure. But well used, it can be a wonderful tool to compare different harvests, to compare behavior, to make picking decisions ahead of time, or at least predict the type of aromas that we're going to be getting. And it's the sugar synthesis or the sugar load that you're going to see in the presentation. And also I'm going to be presenting some of the maturity models that we have built over the years. These models, we have been working on them for more than 15 years, almost 20. They have been proven in different countries, in different areas, and they are, at the end, it's like they're very accurate year to year in terms of how we can predict the type of aromas that we're going to get. So I think Anne and Olivia did an amazing job explaining some of the basics on the analysis that we normally measure, that we normally follow. Some of them are easier, like Brix, pH, TA. We don't need a big equipment in the laboratory. We don't need a lot of people to measure these, sampling and all. When we do have the capability, normally polyphenols are a wonderful complementary information to have. But we all know we need money, we need labor, we need the equipment for this. And of course, sensory, I think, is the last and most wonderful tool that we have available because it's irreplaceable. I mean, the way we taste and we interpret what's happening inside of the vineyards, it's irreplaceable. But when we're talking about sugar synthesis and this concept that I'm going to present now, we're talking about this indicator that can be easily tracked by measuring volume. And if you remember a little bit the classic physiology growth curves that we have on the very volume, you're going to remember, probably see that we have two very well-defined moments of berry growth. We have an initial one that is mainly due to cell division and then cell expansion. We have a moment of plateau, that's when verizon happens. And then we have a second moment of load or synthesis and big increase in volume. This second curve is what we're measuring with the sugar synthesis. And by this, and I think the wonderful thing is that we can have it by a tool, we can measure volume with an instrument, or we can do it in-house. You can do it in your labs, you can measure weight of berries, count the berries, and you can have a very similar information. So in terms of difficulty on how to get this data, I think you have options. When we combine the growth of the volume or the increase of the volume with the concentration of sugar, we get finally the milligrams of sugar per berry. And this information, again, when we're combining it, it gives us a physiological parameter that we can track in time. If we do a sampling right after verizon and until the moment of the picking moment, we're going to have this kind of theoretical curve. This curve is going to show two very well-differentiated moments. One of them is the active sugar load, or the moment where the plant is photosynthesizing. You're going to have a moment where that synthesis is going to stop, and after that, we're not going to see any more synthesis. But you are going to see an increase in Brix. And this is why it's important to make a difference between Brix and sugar synthesis. When we're measuring Brix, that line is going to keep going up and up, but we're going to be comparing different things because the amount of sugar that is being synthesized has reached its peak and it's not going to change. After that, any increase in concentration that we'll see is going to be due to changes in volume. So it can be a dilution or it can be a concentration, and it's normally a concentration what we see. So it's not that the plant is still synthesizing, it's just you're losing water and you're losing sometimes quality with it. To us, at this moment of the peak of the synthesis of sugar, we reach what we call the sugar load stop and the maximum amount of sugar that plant is going to synthesize. This indicator, that amount of sugar that is being synthesized, it's for us a reference of quality. When we have enough sugar, we most likely will have good aromas, a good color, a good concentration in the palate. So they're linked. primary and secondary metabolites, they're linked. And what you were talking about, anthocyanins and all this phenolic ripeness, is very much connected to this very first initial metabolite. When we don't have enough sugar, we will see problems later in quality, and we will have to deal with those in the cellar. So why are we presenting something? Why this could be complementary to your bricks analysis, or could even replace the bricks measurement? Just because we're talking about two different things and two different behaviors. Let's say we have two blocks. So for example, you have block A and B. In terms of synthesis, they're going to behave differently. You're going to have block B, for example, that it stopped earlier, its synthesis, with a higher amount of sugar. And you have block A that it stopped a little later with lower amount of sugar at the peak, right? Later on, if you keep measuring bricks, maybe by concentration they're going to reach the same number. So you're going to be picking at 24, 25 bricks as you want, but the potential and the quality of these blocks are going to be completely different. And we're going to have probably more aromas, more color, better balance in block B than we will do in block A. So keep that in mind, because that information, we can use it to compare blocks, we can use it to compare varieties, we can use it to compare year to year, locations, etc. Just as a reference, we talk, again, we can talk about bricks or concentration. I'm talking about potential alcohol here. It's just the same reference, just a different unit. When you have, at the moment of the sugar load stop, a stop that is higher than 12% of potential alcohol, normally we're talking about a higher potential block or vineyard. When we are between 12 and 11, we say that that block is an intermediate quality, and when we're lower than 11% of alcohol, we are talking about a weak block or something that is going to struggle later in terms of quality. And just an example here, locating different blocks, we can have a good mapping and a good idea of what our qualities are going to look like. So this is, I'm sorry, I don't have information about the area, but you can see how this year was in Napa, for example, for Cabernet Sauvignon. And we have a super interesting harvest where we have a few blocks that reach high quality, an average volume that reached medium quality, but a really high percentage of blocks that were really struggling this year. And that was shocking for a lot of people, and they were waiting for the bricks to change, and the bricks weren't moving. That happens a lot. And the bricks, they don't move, the aromas don't get, the precursors don't get synthesized, and at the end the quality is affected. So just a way of how you can use this information to compare year to year or to prepare for what's coming. So we say this indicator, it's more an integrative indicator of whatever parameter affects your photosynthesis. So you may have parameters, you may have climate factors, you may have stress, you may have nutritional deficiencies that are going to affect the way your vineyard is photosynthesizing, or you may have decisions that you're making in the vineyard, like the number, the grapes that you're leaving, the leafing, etc. So again, this is an integrative indicator that can give you information early on time on what you're going to find at the end. So going into the ripening models, just going to share with you a little bit what we did, just because, you know, when we're talking models, and I'm going to show you the model, it looks like a cartoon that a kid draw. And normally it's like, yeah, that's super simple. Yeah, it goes from green to overripe. That's, you know, it's nothing new. But we did a lot of work behind this, and we repeat this work in every country for every variety, and it was extensive. So I'm just going to share with you how we build them. Normally we took between 20 to 30 blocks of each variety that we wanted to analyze. We did analysis from the beginning of horizon until the very end of the picking. For this we selected chemical analytical analysis. We did Diastem, that is the tool that we have, and once a week for more than a month, 2 months, 3 months, we analyzed these blocks. We had pre-selected at least 3 to 7 picking dates, so we did microvinifications with those, and in those bins that you see in the picture in the middle, We control temperature, we follow exactly the same protocol, and we try to maintain the fermentation conditions as controlled and restricted as possible. After that, we kept doing on the wine, once it was finished and fermented, we keep doing analysis, and then we added the sensory. Because the sensory, again, like Federico was saying before, it just adds a whole layer of information that is irreplaceable. So with the sensory and the chemical analysis and all that chunk of data that we had, we did the models, and we did the analytical statistics analysis that we had to make conclusions out of them. After that, we did a repetition for 3 years, and then later we move into big volume tanks and then validate what we were seeing in these bins. So here's the cartoon, and this is the models that we're following. So we know that after this day 0, the end of the sugar load stop, we're going to have this normal aromatic evolution. And this evolution, it's standard for most of red varieties. What we have is that after this day 0, we have fixed days or fixed windows where we're going to find aromas. And these windows are really fixed, and they are repeated in different countries, in different areas. And for Pinot, we found that, for example, is what we call a short cycle variety. You have between 10 and 12 days after the sugar load stop to pick in fresh, and between 20-25 to pick in ripe after sugar load stop, right? Anything higher than 25 days is what we considered overripe. Again, the style and what you prefer is your winemaking skill and what you want to do. But at least you have a reference, and you can compare year to year when you were picking. Because if you're saying 25 bricks, you may not say the same thing every year, because this number is going to change. And so again, going into the Pinot Noir model and linking this information with the winemaking, we have, again, these windows. And these are the sensory results that we got and how we were able to fix these days after sugar load stop into an aromatic variety, an aromatic window, sorry. So we had 10 to 12 for fresh fruit. Then sometimes we have a window of neutral where we don't have aromas, or there is a decrease in the intensity of the aromas. Then we have ripe fruit, between 20-25 and over 25, like I said, something that will fall into the overripe window. But having this information ahead of time, you may know a month before that it happens that your picking decision had an impact on the final profile. So you could adapt your winemaking. You can prepare for what's coming. And for example, we know that when we harvest in fresh, we're going to have a higher reactivity of the tannins. We're going to have more thiols. We're going to have some fresh profile. We may have some hints of veggie that we need to deal with. So again, we can work on our protocols of fermentation, temperature, yeast, oxygen, oak, etc. In the neutral, I think I'm just going to go to the ripe. Normally, when we're in the ripe fruit window, we're looking to maintain the fruit because we're normally into what we call a terpenic window. And we're going to try to increase fatness and sweetness, even though it's way more than what we had in the fresh window. So again, extraction management, it's key. Try to maintain this viscosity and this sweetness. Probably we're going to have to be more careful with the oxygen just because the matrix is a little less reactive. And we can always play with the oak as a tool just to refresh or to bring something, support the fruit that we want to protect. And on the overripe window, we know this style or this picking decision is going to have an impact on the type of tannins. So we're going to be dealing with some dryness. We're going to be dealing with some aromas that are going to be more into what we call overcooked or dry hay, etc. And then, again, we need to be careful with the extraction that we're doing because we may be drying even more the wine. The oxygen here, it has to be minimum. It has to be very careful dosed, not to dry more the wines. And, of course, the oak can be a complementary tool just to bring the sweetness up. So, again, you have another indicator. It can be done in-house. It can be done with a tool. But if you're precise about classifying your grapes at the beginning, when you're doing your picking decisions, you may be able to connect this with your process, and then finally get the wines that you're looking for. And it's an amazing link between winemaking and viticulture. So I think that's my part. Yeah.
All right, we're a little over time, so I just wanted to open up the floor to any quick questions we had before we wrapped up for the day. Feel free to go to the microphones up here or enter them into your Socio app. Let me start with Jeff. Jeff, could you just speak broadly about how rot might affect your considerations for sampling and logistics?
Yeah, I think it depends on if you want that in there. And I know that sounds silly, but if, obviously if we're making Pinot Noir, you probably don't want it in there, so I'm not going to go out and sample it because I'm going to have the step at the bin, the step at the winery where we're going to try to exclude it, so there's no point in sampling it. If it's Riesling and we're looking for botrytis, I'm going to sample that so that we're actually getting something that's representative of what's going to be coming in. So yeah, it influences basically what we do out there, for sure.
Excellent. Any questions from the audience? Having some trouble with the Socio app up here. All right. Well, thanks a bunch. Thanks for the panel and all their effort to get this going and go enjoy the soiree. Yeah. Cheers.